Picture this, a frozen tree line somewhere east of Kupiansk. It is 4:47 in the morning. The temperature has dropped to minus 19 degrees Celsius. A Russian BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle sits motionless on a dirt road, its engine cold, its hatches open. The vehicle has not moved in 11 hours. The crew, 6 men, all conscripts from the Sverdlovsk Oblast, are gone. Not killed, not captured, gone. Their weapons are stacked neatly against a pine tree, as if placed there by someone who wanted to make a point. Their rations are untouched. A single note, written in crude block letters on the back of a military issue map, reads 4 words in Russian that translate to this: "We are not going." That note, recovered by a Ukrainian reconnaissance unit and later verified by the Security Service of Ukraine and cross-referenced by analysts at the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, D.C., is not an isolated incident. It is not a rumor. It is not Ukrainian propaganda. It is a data point, one of thousands, in what is now being described by senior NATO intelligence officials as the most severe internal cohesion crisis inside a nuclear-armed military since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And Amanda is about to show you exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes. Because here is the thing that the mainstream coverage keeps missing. The story is not about one unit refusing orders. The story is not about one frozen vehicle on one frozen road. The story is about a system, a vast creaking Soviet-era military bureaucracy that is eating itself alive from the inside. And the evidence, when you lay it out piece by piece, does not look like isolated incidents of poor morale. It looks like structural disintegration. It looks like the beginning of something that military historians will be writing about for the next 50 years. Let us establish the baseline first, because the numbers matter. According to data compiled by the Conflict Intelligence Team, the open-source intelligence organization known as CIT, which has been tracking Russian military movements since February 2022, documented cases of Russian soldiers filing official complaints known in Russian military law as rapport, citing unlawful orders, dangerous conditions, or outright refusal to advance, have increased by an estimated 340% between the first quarter of 2023 and the third quarter of 2024. That is not a marginal uptick. That is not noise in the data. That is a signal so loud it should be setting off alarm bells in every defense ministry from Berlin to Washington. But the official numbers, as staggering as they are, tell only part of the story. Because the Russian military legal system was not designed to handle this volume of dissent. It was designed for a different era, an era when the fear of the state was so absolute, so total, so physically present in every barracks and every officer's mess that the idea of a soldier saying no was almost literally inconceivable. That era is over, and the machinery that replaced fear with compliance has broken down in ways that even Kremlin insiders are now struggling to explain. Here's where the paradigm shifts completely. For 30 years, Western defense analysts operated under a specific assumption about the Russian military. The assumption was this: whatever its technical shortcomings, whatever its logistical failures, whatever its corruption problems, the Russian soldier would fight. He would advance. He would absorb casualties at rates that would be politically impossible in a Western democracy, and he would keep moving. This assumption was baked into every NATO contingency plan. It was the foundation of every threat assessment. It was the reason Finland spent decades building the most fortified border architecture in Northern Europe. The Russian soldier, in the Western strategic imagination, was an inexhaustible human resource, brutal, blunt, but ultimately unstoppable through sheer mass. That assumption is now dead, and its death changes everything. The inflection point, the precise moment when analysts began to understand that something categorically different was happening, came not from a dramatic battlefield event, but from a legal filing. In October 2023, the independent Russian human rights organization Crew Against Torture, operating out of exile in Tbilisi, Georgia, published a report documenting over 1,700 individual cases of Russian servicemen who had attempted to use the Russian military's own legal framework to refuse combat deployment or withdraw from active frontline duty. 1,700 cases, and that figure represented only the cases where soldiers had access to legal counsel, which in the Russian military context is an extraordinarily rare circumstance. The actual number, extrapolated by analysts at the Royal United Services Institute in London, known as RUSI, is estimated to be between 8 and 12 times higher. 8 to 12 times higher. Let that number sit for a moment. General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, C'est sûr, in a classified briefing later partially declassified and reported by Defense One in early 2024, described the Russian military's personnel situation as, quote, a compounding crisis with no visible resolution pathway under the current command structure. That is diplomatic language. Translated into plain English, it means this. The people at the very top of NATO's military chain of command believe that the Russian army is running out of men who are willing to fight, and they do not see how Moscow fixes that problem without doing something so drastic that it carries its own catastrophic risks. But while the headlines focused on the battlefield numbers, something far more sinister was happening inside the Russian military's own disciplinary apparatus, and almost nobody was paying attention. The Russian military penal system, the network of Strafbat successor units, detention facilities, and military tribunals that Moscow uses to process soldiers who refuse orders, was, by the spring of 2024, operating at a capacity that its infrastructure was never designed to handle. Sources inside the Russian military legal system, speaking anonymously to the independent investigative outlet iStories, Important Stories, described a situation in which military prosecutors were being quietly instructed to reduce charges, issue administrative penalties rather than criminal ones, and in some cases simply return soldiers to non-combat rear positions rather than pursue formal prosecution. Why? Because the prisons were full, because the tribunals were backlogged by months, and because the Kremlin had made a calculated decision that publicly prosecuting thousands of its own soldiers for cowardice was a propaganda catastrophe it could not afford. Think about what that means. The Russian state, a state that has historically used judicial terror as a primary tool of military discipline, a state whose legal system exists specifically to make examples of dissent, is quietly backing down. It is choosing bureaucratic discretion over punitive force. It is, in the language of political science, losing its monopoly on the legitimate use of fear. And this is where the story gets truly dangerous. Because a military that cannot punish refusal effectively and cannot incentivize compliance financially, and we will get to the financial dimension in a moment because it is staggering, is a military that is being held together by nothing more than social inertia and geographic isolation. And both of those forces have a half-life. They decay. They expire. And when they do, what replaces them is not discipline. What replaces them is chaos. To understand the financial dimension of this collapse, you need to understand how the Russian military recruitment machine actually works. Not how it is described in Kremlin press releases. Not how it appears in the sanitized reports that Russian state television broadcasts to a domestic audience that has largely stopped believing what it sees on screen. How it actually works. Because the gap between those two realities is where the crisis lives. When Russia announced its so-called partial mobilization in September 2022, a declaration that triggered the single largest exodus of Russian citizens since World War II, with an estimated 700,000 men fleeing across borders into Finland, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia within the first 2 weeks alone, the Kremlin made a promise. Contract soldiers, volunteers, and mobilized conscripts would receive monthly payments ranging from 195,000 to 210,000 rubles. At the exchange rate of that period, that translated to roughly $2,100 to $2,300 per month. For men from depressed industrial regions, from Buryatia, from Dagestan, from the hollowed-out former factory towns of the Urals, that figure represented more money than many of them had ever seen in a single month of civilian life. It was a number designed to make the calculus of survival feel like a reasonable trade. But the payments stopped arriving, not everywhere, not for everyone, but with a frequency and geographic consistency that cannot be explained by administrative error. By the summer of 2023, monitoring groups including OVD Info and Mediazona, both operating under extraordinary pressure from Russian authorities, had documented hundreds of cases in which families of deployed soldiers reported months of missing payments, death benefits denied on technicalities, and wounded soldiers discharged without the disability compensation they were legally entitled to. The Russian state was, in effect, writing checks it could not cash, and the soldiers on the front lines knew it. Here is a number that crystallizes the entire financial dimension of this crisis. According to analysis published by the Kyiv School of Economics in February 2024, Russia's war expenditure had by that point consumed an estimated 40% of its total federal budget. 40%. The Russian government was spending more on the war machine than on healthcare, education, and social services combined. And yet the money was not reaching the men in the trenches. It was vanishing into a procurement system so corrupt, so thoroughly hollowed out by decades of institutional theft, that Western sanctions did not need to destroy it. It was destroying itself. Colonel Hamish de Breton-Gordon, former commanding officer of NATO's CBRN forces and now a senior fellow at Cambridge University, described the Russian military's logistical and financial situation in a January 2024 interview with The Telegraph as, quote, a Ponzi scheme wearing a uniform. That metaphor is more precise than it might initially appear. A Ponzi scheme functions as long as new participants keep entering the system and the illusion of returns is maintained. The moment the new participants stop coming, the moment the pipeline of willing bodies dries up, the entire structure collapses inward with astonishing speed. And the pipeline, by every measurable metric available to Western intelligence, is drying up. Recruitment offices across Russia's interior regions, the so-called voenkomati, are reporting sign-up rates that have fallen dramatically from the surge figures of late 2022. In Siberian federal districts, local officials speaking to regional outlets that have not yet been fully suppressed describe offices that are functionally empty for days at a time. The men who came voluntarily in 2022, motivated by money or nationalism or social pressure, have largely already gone. What remains is a population that has watched those men come home in zinc coffins, or not come home at all, and has made its own quiet calculation about the value of the contract being offered. And this is the moment where you need to pay close attention, because what happens next in this story is not what most analysts predicted. Most analysts assume that the Kremlin, faced with a recruitment crisis, would simply expand coercive mobilization, round up more men, lower the age thresholds, broaden the geographic net, apply more pressure, and to some extent, that is exactly what Moscow has attempted. Reports from human rights monitors throughout 2023 and into 2024 documented cases of men being handed draft papers in shopping centers, outside metro stations, in hospital waiting rooms. The machinery of compulsion was being cranked up to compensate for the collapse of voluntary enlistment. But here is what the Kremlin did not anticipate, and what represents perhaps the most significant strategic miscalculation of the entire conflict. Coerced soldiers do not fight the same way as motivated soldiers. This is not a philosophical observation. It is a battlefield-validated, empirically documented military science fact. Research conducted by the RAND Corporation, published in their 2023 report titled Conscript Quality and Combat Effectiveness in Conventional Warfare, established through analysis of 14 post-Cold War conflicts that units composed primarily of coerced or financially incentivized conscripts with low unit cohesion demonstrate combat effectiveness ratings approximately 60 to 70% lower than professional volunteer formations with equivalent equipment. 60 to 70% lower. With equivalent equipment, the weapons do not compensate for the will. They believed the sheer weight of mass mobilization would grind down Ukrainian defenses through attrition alone. They were wrong. And the price of that miscalculation is being paid not in rubles and not in territory, but in something far more difficult to replace. It is being paid in the psychological architecture of the Russian military itself. Because what is happening now, what the classified assessments from GCHQ, from the BND, from the CIA's Directorate of Analysis are all independently converging on, is something that military psychologists call cascading morale failure. It is a phenomenon distinct from ordinary low morale. Ordinary low morale is a condition. Cascading morale failure is a process. It is self-reinforcing, self-accelerating, and extraordinarily difficult to reverse once it reaches a certain threshold. It works like this. When a critical mass of soldiers within a unit observe that other soldiers are refusing orders without being immediately and visibly punished, the calculus of personal risk changes for every remaining soldier in that unit. The social contract that holds a military formation together, the implicit agreement that everyone will advance because everyone knows that everyone else will advance, begins to dissolve. And once it begins to dissolve, it dissolves faster and faster, because each new act of refusal makes the next act of refusal feel safer, more rational, more justified. Military historians will recognize this dynamic immediately. It is precisely what happened to the French army in 1917, when widespread mutinies following the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive rendered entire divisions combat ineffective for months. It is what happened to the American military in Vietnam between 1969 and 1971, when fragging incidents, the killing of officers by their own men, reached numbers that the Pentagon classified for decades. It is what happened to the Russian Imperial Army in 1917, in the months before the February Revolution, when frontline units began simply walking away from their positions in numbers so large that no disciplinary apparatus could contain them. The Russian military is not at 1917 levels. Not yet, but the structural preconditions, the financial betrayal, the legal system's quiet retreat from punishment, the visibility of refusal without consequence, the cascading psychological effect on unit cohesion, are all present. They are all active, and they are all moving in the same direction. While the media focused on drone strikes and territorial lines on a map, the Russian 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, one of Moscow's most celebrated and heavily publicized formations, repeatedly featured in Kremlin propaganda as an elite frontline unit, filed what Russian military legal sources described to the Meduza investigative outlet as a collective complaint involving over 500 individual soldiers, citing systematic violations of their service contracts, illegal extension of combat tours beyond the legally mandated period, and conditions amounting to what the complaint described as deliberate exposure to destruction. 500 soldiers in one brigade, filing a collective legal action against their own chain of command. This is not a morale problem. This is a mutiny dressed in legal language. And the Kremlin's response, to quietly reassign the brigade's commanding officer and offer partial back payment of outstanding wages, tells you everything you need to know about how confident Moscow actually is in its ability to enforce discipline through fear alone. But while the world watched the political maneuvering in Moscow, something was happening at the command level that no state television broadcast would ever acknowledge, and that changes the strategic picture in ways that most commentators have not yet fully processed. The command-level crisis is, in many ways, more dangerous than anything happening among the enlisted ranks. Because enlisted soldiers refusing to advance is a tactical problem. Senior officers losing faith in the strategic direction of the war is an existential one. And the evidence that this is already happening, that the fracture is not confined to frozen tree lines and empty barracks, but has penetrated upward into the professional officer corps itself, is now substantial enough that it can no longer be dismissed as speculation or wishful thinking from Kiev's information warfare apparatus. Consider the documented pattern of command-level dismissals. Since January 2023, the Russian military has relieved, reassigned, arrested, or caused to disappear, in the specific bureaucratic sense that Russian officials use when they mean something far darker, an extraordinary number of senior commanders. General Ivan Popov, commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army, was dismissed in July 2023 after sending a recorded voice message to his troops describing, in his own words, the treachery of senior leadership and the criminal neglect of Russian soldiers dying from Ukrainian artillery, while headquarters refused to acknowledge the scale of losses. General Popov did not simply criticize tactical decisions. He described a command structure that he characterized as systematically lying to itself about battlefield reality. He was arrested within 48 hours, but his message had already been distributed to tens of thousands of Russian soldiers via telegram channels that Russian military censors cannot fully suppress. Popov was not alone. Colonel General Mikhail Mizintsev, formerly known as the Butcher of Mariupol for his role in the siege of that city, was removed from his position as Deputy Defense Minister in April 2023 under circumstances that Russian state media refused to explain. Lieutenant General Yuri Stavitsky, responsible for logistics in the Southern Theater, was quietly replaced in circumstances that multiple Russian military bloggers, the so-called Vonkuri community, whose independence from the Kremlin has become one of the most remarkable features of Russian information space in this conflict, described as connected to catastrophic failures in ammunition supply chains that left frontline units firing at rationed rates of less than 10 artillery rounds per gun per day. 10 rounds per gun per day? For context, Ukrainian forces during the same period, despite their own ammunition challenges, were sustaining rates of fire 3 to 4 times higher with Western-supplied systems. The Voinkori, military bloggers like Rybar, Two Majors, and the channel formerly associated with Yevgeny Prigozhin's information network, represent something genuinely unprecedented in Russian military culture. They are, functionally, an uncontrolled information ecosystem operating inside the information space of an authoritarian state at war. And what they have been publishing, with a consistency and specificity that suggests access to genuine frontline sources, paints a picture of Russian military command that is almost unrecognizable from the triumphalist narrative of state television. They describe units being sent into assault operations with no artillery preparation because there are no shells. They describe medical evacuation chains so broken that wounded soldiers are dying of treatable injuries because there are no vehicles to move them. They describe a rotation system so collapsed that some infantry units have been in continuous front-line contact for periods exceeding 14 months without relief. 14 months without rotation, without rest, without the basic psychological decompression that every military doctrine in the world recognizes as essential for preventing complete combat stress breakdown. And this is where the technical reality of what Russia is attempting becomes not just strategically unsound, but clinically incoherent. The Russian military's doctrinal framework, the framework inherited from Soviet operational art, refined through the Chechen campaigns, and theoretically updated through the Syrian intervention, was built around the assumption of combined arms operations, artillery preparation, engineer support, armor and infantry integration, electronic warfare suppression of enemy communications. The doctrine assumed these elements would function together as a system. What is happening on the ground in eastern Ukraine is the systematic failure of every one of these integrated elements simultaneously, forcing Russian infantry into the role of compensating for all of them with their bodies alone. The EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft that NATO allies have used to train Ukrainian signals operators has given Ukrainian forces the ability to detect and disrupt Russian command frequencies with a precision that Russian electronic warfare systems, the Krasuka-4 and the Borisogledsk-2, both of which were celebrated in pre-war assessments as world-class capabilities, have proven unable to counter effectively at the tactical level. The result is that Russian units advancing on Ukrainian positions are frequently doing so in a communications blackout, unable to call for fire support, unable to coordinate flanking movements, unable to request medical evacuation. They are, in the most literal military sense, alone. And men who are alone, who are financially betrayed, who have watched their commanders be arrested for telling the truth, who have seen their legal complaints ignored or quietly suppressed, those men eventually make a very simple decision. They decide that survival is more important than the objective, and they walk away from the objective, into the tree line, into the frozen darkness, away. There were only 90 minutes left before a scheduled assault on a fortified Ukrainian position near Avdiivka in the winter of 2023, when an entire Russian company, approximately 80 to 100 men, simply failed to move to their jump-off positions. The assault was cancelled. The objective was not taken. The incident, documented by Ukrainian military intelligence and later corroborated by Russian military sources speaking to Meduza, produced no mass arrests, no public court-martials, no visible punitive response from the chain of command. The silence from Moscow was, in its own way, more revealing than any official statement could have been. It confirmed what the data had been suggesting for months. The Kremlin no longer fully controls its own army's willingness to fight, and it knows it. So where does this lead? Because a crisis of this magnitude does not resolve itself. It either stabilizes through intervention, accelerates toward collapse, or transforms into something new and potentially more dangerous than the original condition. And the analytical community, from the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London to the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, from the Swedish Defense Research Agency to the Norwegian Intelligence Service, is currently divided, with genuine intellectual honesty, into three distinct schools of thought about what comes next. And Amanda is going to lay out all three of them, without filtering, without agenda, because you deserve the full picture. The first scenario is what analysts call managed adaptation. In this trajectory, the Kremlin successfully implements a combination of structural reforms, genuine rotation policies, improved payment systems, reduced reliance on assault tactics that generate catastrophic casualties, alongside an expanded coercive mobilization apparatus that compensates for the collapse of voluntary enlistment through sheer bureaucratic compulsion. In this scenario, the Russian military does not recover its pre-war capabilities, but it stabilizes at a level sufficient to maintain a grinding, attritional front line indefinitely. This is not a victory for Moscow, but it is not a collapse either. It is a frozen conflict sustained by institutional inertia and the brute demographic weight of a country with 144 million people. Analysts at CSIS assess this scenario at roughly 30 to 35% probability, contingent on two factors: whether Western military aid to Ukraine is sustained at current levels, and whether the Russian domestic information environment remains sufficiently controlled to prevent the scale of battlefield failure from becoming politically toxic inside Russia itself. The second scenario is strategic reorientation, what some analysts, including Dr. Michael Kaufman of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, have described as coercive diplomacy from a position of managed weakness. In this trajectory, the accumulating internal pressures, the morale crisis, the financial strain consuming 40% of federal budget, the command dysfunction, the international isolation, combine to create a window in which Kremlin leadership, or a successor leadership emerging from internal political turbulence, seeks a negotiated pause. Not a peace, not a surrender, a pause. A frozen line of contact formalized into a de facto ceasefire that allows Moscow to reconstitute, rearm, and reframe the narrative domestically as a form of strategic patience rather than defeat. This scenario is, in many ways, the most dangerous for long-term European security, because it would preserve Russian military capacity while eliminating the immediate pressure that is currently accelerating the internal disintegration. RUSI analysts place this scenario at approximately 40% probability over an 18-month horizon. The third scenario is the one that nobody in official Washington or Brussels will say out loud in a public forum, but that every serious analyst has modeled in classified settings. It is accelerated disintegration. In this trajectory, the cascading morale failure crosses its critical threshold, the point at which the self-reinforcing logic of mass refusal becomes impossible to contain through any combination of punishment and incentive. Units stop functioning not as isolated incidents, but as a systemic pattern. The Voinkory information ecosystem, operating beyond effective Kremlin control, broadcasts the reality in real time to an audience of millions of Russian soldiers and their families. The political cost of the war inside Russia, already rising, already visible in the quiet fury of women's protest movements and the desperate searches of families for information about missing soldiers, reaches a level that fractures the elite consensus that has sustained Putin's grip on power. What follows is not necessarily a democratic transition or a clean political resolution. What follows could be something far more volatile: a scramble for power among military and security elites, regional governors asserting autonomy, the entire elaborate architecture of the Russian state, already deeply stressed, cracking along fault lines that have been widening for decades. This scenario carries a probability that most analysts are reluctant to quantify precisely, because its very unpredictability is part of what makes it so analytically resistant. But none of them, not one serious analyst in London, Washington, Stockholm, or Warsaw, is willing to assign it a probability of 0. And that is the detail that should stop you cold. Because we are not talking about a fringe hypothesis. We are not talking about optimistic Ukrainian information warfare. We are talking about the considered analytical judgment of the Western world's most rigorous defense institutions, that one of the three most likely trajectories for the Russian military over the next 18 months involves a form of disintegration whose consequences for a nuclear-armed state are, by definition, incalculable. The note left against that pine tree east of Kupiansk, 4 words written by a scared young man from the Urals who decided that no objective, no ideology, no payment that never arrived was worth his life. That note is not a curiosity. It is not an anecdote. It is a symptom of something vast and structural and accelerating. Armies do not collapse because of one refusal. They collapse because of 10,000 refusals, each one making the next one easier, each one dissolving another thread of the social fabric that makes organized violence possible. Russia is not there yet, but the direction of travel is clear, the velocity is increasing, and the destination, if nothing intervenes, leads somewhere that the entire world, not just Ukraine, not just NATO, but every nation that shares a planet with a nuclear arsenal in institutional freefall, will have to reckon with. The Russian soldier standing in the frozen dark, weighing his life against an order from a command structure that has already betrayed him financially, legally, and morally, that soldier is making a decision. He is making it quietly, without speeches, without manifestos, without the dramatic gestures of historical rebellion. He is making it the way most history is actually made, one exhausted, terrified, rational human being at a time. And when enough of them make it, when the threshold is crossed and the cascade becomes a flood, the world that emerges on the other side will not look like the world that existed before February 24th, 2022. It will not look like anything in the existing playbook, because the Russian military, for all its brutality and all its failures, has been the central organizing fact of European security for 80 years. What happens when that fact changes is not a question with a clean answer. It is a question with consequences, and those consequences are already, quietly, irreversibly, beginning to unfold. The soldiers of the Russian Federation are making their choice. The question now is whether the rest of the world is paying close enough attention to make its own.